There is particular cruel irony in the way avoidants often end up falling deeply in love with the empath they rejected. The empath was there during the relationship, providing understanding, patience, compassion, and emotional support. But the empath's very qualities that made them valuable as partner were the same qualities that triggered the avoidance withdrawal. The empath was too much in their presence, too feeling, too needy, too everything. So the avoidant pushed them away, convinced themselves the relationship would not work, and moved forward alone. But months or years later, when the avoidant has had time to process the loss and to recognize what their patterns have cost them, they often find themselves falling in love with the memory of the empath they rejected. The falling in love does not come from the empath having changed or from the avoidant suddenly having the capacity they lacked before. Instead, it comes from the avoidant's changed perspective on what the empath was offering and what the avoidant was running from. The empath's emotional depth that once felt suffocating now feels like home. The empath's sensitivity that once felt like burden now feels like gift. The empath's willingness to keep showing up despite rejection now feels like the greatest love story the avoidant has ever witnessed. The avoidant falls in love with realization of how valuable the empath was and how much the avoidant gave up through their inability to handle the empath's emotional intensity. Understanding why avoidants fall in love with the empaths they rejected requires understanding the specific ways empaths trigger avoidant defenses, why the avoidant's rejection felt necessary in the moment, what shifts in the avoidant's perception over time, and how the avoidant's growing recognition of the empath's value can create obsessive form of love that may be more about regret than about genuine transformation. What makes empaths triggering to avoidance? The empath's primary characteristic is their ability to feel deeply and their natural inclination to extend that emotional capacity toward others. Empaths experience other people's emotions as though those emotions are their own. They feel the pain of those around them. They sense unspoken needs and unacknowledged feelings. They respond to emotional distress with genuine compassion and desire to help. This emotional depth and sensitivity makes empaths exceptionally triggering to avoidance. The avoidant's entire defensive system is built on avoiding emotional intensity and protecting themselves from being overwhelmed by others' feelings. The avoidant learned early that emotional expression was unsafe or that their own needs would be ignored if they expressed them. They developed strategies of withdrawal and emotional distance to manage their own anxiety. These strategies work by keeping emotional intensity at manageable level. But the empath's presence constantly activates the avoidant's emotional system. The empath wants to discuss feelings. The empath wants connection and intimacy and emotional availability. The empath can sense when the avoidant is struggling and wants to help even when the avoidant does not want help. The empath's emotional presence does not give the avoidant space to maintain their careful emotional distance. The empath's natural inclination toward connection directly conflicts with the avoidant's need for space. The avoidant experiences the empath's emotional intensity as suffocation. The empath's sensitivity feels like pressure. The empath's attempts to connect feel like invasion of the avoidant's carefully protected inner world. The avoidant begins to see the empath as too much, too demanding, too needy. The avoidant convinces themselves that the empath's emotional needs are excessive and that no one could reasonably be expected to meet them. The empath also triggers the avoidant's shame. The empath's deep emotional capacity and willingness to be vulnerable with the avoidant reveals by contrast how defended and withdrawn the avoidant is. The empath's openness highlights the avoidant's guardedness. The empath's emotional investment shows up the avoidant's emotional distance. The avoidant feels ashamed of their inability to match the empath's emotional capacity. Rather than working to develop that capacity, the avoidant projects the shame onto the empath and decides the empath is the problem. The avoidant also may be triggered by the empath's tendency to absorb the avoidant's emotional pain. The empath can sense the avoidant's wounds and wants to help heal them. The empath offers understanding of where the avoidance patterns come from. But this understanding and acceptance of the avoidance wounds can feel suffocating to the avoidant. The avoidant does not want to be seen so clearly or understood so deeply. The avoidant is not ready to process their wounds. The empath's willingness to hold space for the avoidant's pain feels like invasion rather than support. The avoidant also may be triggered by the empath's refusal to take the avoidant's withdrawal personally. The empath understands that the avoidant's distance is not about the empath, but about the avoidant's own fear. The empath continues to show compassion and understanding even when being rejected. This refusal to take the rejection personally and this continued offering of compassion can make the avoidant feel exposed and seen in ways that generate intense discomfort. The avoidant cannot maintain the narrative that the empath is to blame when the empath keeps responding with understanding. Why the rejection felt necessary. The avoidant's rejection of the empath was not calculated cruelty, but rather desperate attempt to manage unbearable emotional intensity. In the moment of rejection, the avoidant truly believed they were making right choice. The avoidant was convinced the relationship was suffocating them. The avoidant believed they needed space and freedom more than they needed connection. The avoidant told themselves they were incompatible with the empath's emotional needs. The avoidant decided the most honest thing they could do was leave rather than continue disappointing the empath. All of these rationalizations contained some element of truth. The relationship was difficult. The avoidant was struggling with intimacy. The avoidant could not consistently meet the empath's emotional needs. But what the avoidant could not see in the moment was that the difficulty and the struggle were not the empath's fault. The avoidant was unable to distinguish between the empath being too much and the avoidant being unable to handle normal human emotional connection. The rejection felt necessary because the avoidant's anxiety about the relationship had escalated to unbearable levels. The more the empath tried to connect, the more the avoidant felt panicked. The avoidant's panic was so intense that staying in the relationship felt genuinely dangerous. So the avoidant left, convinced they were doing both themselves and the empath a favor. The avoidant told themselves the empath would be better off with someone who could meet their needs. The avoidant believed the separation was necessary for everyone's well-being. The rejection also felt necessary because the avoidant was unable to communicate what they actually needed. Rather than telling the empath they needed more space or setting boundaries about the intensity of connection, the avoidant simply withdrew completely. The complete withdrawal communicated rejection, even if the avoidant was not consciously choosing rejection. The avoidant was simply doing what their defensive system automatically did when emotional intensity became too high. The automatic response felt like necessary act of self-preservation. What changes in the avoidant's perspective over time? After months or years of separation, the avoidant's perspective on what the empath was offering shifts dramatically. The immediate intensity that felt suffocating when present begins to feel like precious thing that the avoidant no longer has access to. The avoidant begins to recognize that the empath's emotional depth was not flaw but feature. The avoidant begins to understand that the empath's willingness to be vulnerable and to keep showing up despite rejection was actually demonstration of genuine love. The passage of time allows the avoidant to process their own feelings about the loss. At pace their anxious system can tolerate. The avoidant has had space to live alone and to recognize the cost of that space. They have had time to recognize that independence without connection is emptiness rather than freedom. They have had months or years to think about moments with the empath and to recognize the genuine warmth that was present. The realization comes gradually and then suddenly. The avoidant's perspective also shifts as they observe the empath's life after the separation. If the empath has moved forward and found happiness, the avoidant may experience complicated mixture of relief and regret. Relief that the empath is no longer suffering because of the rejection. Regret that the empath found happiness with someone else. If the empath has struggled and suffered, the avoidant may feel crushing guilt about having been source of that pain. Either way, the avoidant's awareness of the empath's experience after the breakup creates different perspective on the empath than the avoidant had during the relationship. The avoidant's perspective also shifts because the avoidant has likely experienced how their patterns play out in subsequent relationships or in their life generally. The avoidant has probably found that they continue to withdraw and that other people also experience them as cold or distant. Or the avoidant has found that subsequent relationships lack the depth and authenticity that the empath offered. The avoidant begins to recognize that the problem was not the empath being too much, but the avoidant being defended against normal human connection. The avoidant also begins to recognize the specific ways the empath was uniquely suited to them, even if the avoidant was not capable of appreciating it at the time. The empath's emotional depth that felt overwhelming in the moment is now recognized as wisdom and insight that the avoidant values. The empath's sensitivity is now recognized as attunement to the avoidant's unspoken needs. The empath's patience is now recognized as rare gift that the avoidant did not deserve. The avoidant begins to see all the specific ways the empath was perfect for them and how the avoidant was the one who was wrong. How the avoidant becomes obsessed with the memory of the empath. Once the avoidant begins to recognize what they lost, they often become obsessed with the memory of the empath. This obsession is not exactly same as love, although the avoidant may convince themselves it is. The obsession is actually a mixture of regret, guilt, and desire to undo the past. The avoidant cannot undo the past, but they can obsess about it. The avoidant begins to think constantly about the empath. They replay moments from the relationship, looking for evidence of their mistake. They remember conversations where the empath tried to tell the avoidant what they needed and the avoidant refused to listen. They remember the look in the empath's eyes when they finally accepted the rejection. They remember the empath's attempts to reach out and the avoidant's cold responses. The memories are painful because they reveal the avoidant's cruelty through their neglect. The avoidant may begin to check on the empath's life through social media or through mutual friends. They want to know whether the empath is happy. They want to know whether the empath has moved on. They want to know whether the empath is thinking about them. The checking is a form of torture because any evidence that the empath is thriving creates guilt and regret. Any evidence that the empath is struggling creates guilt for being source of that struggle. The avoidant may begin to fantasize about reconnecting with the empath. The avoidant imagines a conversation where they finally tell the empath they were wrong. The avoidant imagines the empath's response and how the empath might forgive them. The avoidant imagines a second chance where they would handle things differently. The fantasies create emotional intensity that the avoidant initially ran from but now craves. The fantasies are safer than actual contact because they cannot be rejected in fantasies. The avoidant's obsession with the empath may reach a point where they attempt to contact the empath. They reach out with message expressing their regret and their recognition of the empath's value. They may ask for forgiveness or another chance. They may simply express that they have been thinking about the empath and wanted to tell them they are sorry. The reaching out comes from genuine feeling, but also from need to manage their own guilt and regret. Why the avoidant's love feels so intense. The avoidance falling in love with the memory of the rejected empath feels intensely passionate and all-consuming, in ways that their original relationship may not have felt. This intensity comes partly from the fact that the avoidant is no longer defending against the intensity. The avoidant has had time to process their fear, and the obsession creates a rush of emotional energy that the avoidant initially ran from but now is able to experience at distance. The intensity also comes from the tragedy of the situation. The avoidant has fallen in love with someone they can no longer have, or who may not want them back. The sense of loss and the difficulty of accessing this love creates emotional intensity that makes the love feel profound. If the empath has moved on or has built wall against the avoidant, due to past hurt, the avoidant experiences the love as unrequited. Unrequited love has particular intensity because the lover is focused entirely on the object of their love without the distraction of actual relationship dynamics. The avoidant's love also feels intense because it is partly about the avoidant, rather than about the empath. The love is intertwined with guilt, with regret, with recognition of their own failure. The love is about what the avoidant lost and what the avoidant took for granted. The love is about the avoidant's wish to undo the past and to be different than they were. The intensity of this constellation of feelings creates sensation of passionate love, even though it may not be as pure as the empath's original love was. The avoidance love may also feel intense because the avoidant has idealized the empath in absence. The actual empath with their flaws and their own struggles has been replaced by perfect fantasy version of the empath. The fantasy version is everything the avoidant claimed to want to escape, but now recognizes as exactly what they needed. The fantasy version does not have the actual demands of real relationship, but instead exists in the avoidant's memory as perfect embodiment of what they failed to appreciate. What this reveals about avoidant patterns. The avoidance falling in love with the rejected empath reveals important truths about how avoidant attachment actually works and why it creates so much pain for those who love avoidance. It reveals that the avoidant's rejection of the empath was not about genuine incompatibility, but about the avoidant's inability to handle healthy intimacy in the moment. It reveals that avoidants often do not know what they want until they no longer have access to it. The avoidant could not appreciate the empath's emotional depth while receiving it, but desperately wants it once it is gone. This pattern suggests that the problem is not with what the empath was offering, but with the avoidant's capacity to receive it. The avoidant was not ready for what the empath was giving. The avoidant needed to grow before they could genuinely value what the empath offered. It also reveals that avoidants often fall in love with the idea of the person rather than with the actual person. The avoidant's love for the memory of the empath is not the same as love for the empath as they are now. The empath has moved forward. The empath has changed. The empath has likely put up protective walls that would not have existed if the avoidant had valued them when they had the chance. The avoidant is in love with a version of the empath that no longer exists. It also reveals that avoidants are often capable of deep feeling, but have difficulty accessing that feeling in real time. The avoidant can feel devastated about losing the empath while being unable to feel enough in the moment to actually be present with the empath. This suggests that the avoidance withdrawal is defense mechanism more than genuine preference for solitude. The avoidant actually wants connection, but their fear of connection is stronger than their desire for it. During the actual relationship, why the empath often cannot accept the avoidant's belated love. When the avoidant does reach out to the rejected empath with expressions of love and regret, the empath often cannot accept the love even if the empath still cares about the avoidant. The empath has learned through painful experience that the avoidant's capacity for presence is limited. The empath may still love the avoidant, but has learned that loving the avoidant is costly. The empath has built walls to protect themselves from further hurt. The empath may also recognize that the avoidant's love is actually about the avoidant's own regret and guilt, rather than about genuine desire to be present with the empath. The empath has learned to read the avoidant accurately and can tell when the avoidant is motivated by discomfort with their own guilt, rather than by commitment to the empath's well-being. The empath knows that responding to the avoidant's belated love would result in the avoidant eventually withdrawing again once the immediate guilt is processed. The empath may also have moved on genuinely. The empath has invested time in healing and in building life independent of the avoidant. The empath has recognized that they deserve partner who can show up consistently and that waiting for the avoidant to change is not viable strategy. The empath's moving on is act of self-preservation that the avoidant must respect, even as the avoidant grieves losing the opportunity for reconciliation. The empath may also reject the avoidant's belated love because the empath recognizes that genuine transformation would need to precede the love, not follow it. The empath would need to see evidence that the avoidant has done actual therapeutic work on their patterns. The empath would need to see that the avoidant can sustain presence and emotional availability over time, not just in moments of peak regret. The empath's boundaries are finally strong enough to require the avoidant to actually change rather than to accept promises of change. The tragedy of avoidant love for empaths. The tragedy of the avoidant's love for the rejected empath is that by the time the avoidant is capable of genuinely valuing what the empath offered, the empath has often moved too far forward to turn back. The timing is chronically off. The empath's love arrives when the avoidant is not ready. The avoidant's love arrives when the empath has learned to protect themselves. This tragedy repeats itself across many relationships between avoidants and empaths. The empath offers deep connection and the avoidant runs from it. The avoidant eventually regrets the running and falls in love with the memory of what they lost. But by then, the empath has often been hurt enough to decide that their own well-being requires distance from the avoidant. The avoidant learns to value what the empath offered only after the avoidant has ensured that the empath will no longer offer it. The tragedy also reveals that true love from the avoidant toward the empath may actually require the separation and the loss. The avoidant may only be capable of recognizing the empath's value once the empath is no longer present to trigger the avoidant's defenses. The closeness that would allow for genuine partnership remains impossible because the very presence of the empath activates the avoidant's fear. The avoidant can love the memory of the empath, but may never be able to love the actual empath in real time. This is tragic for the empath who offered genuine love and was rejected for it. The empath has to live with knowledge that they were rejected for being too loving, too feeling, too present. The empath may wonder if there was anything they could have done differently that would have made the avoidant capable of receiving their love. The empath may question whether they were wrong to offer so much compassion to someone incapable of appreciating it. Why avoidants can fall in love with the empath's qualities only after rejection. The fundamental reason avoidants fall in love with rejected empaths is that the avoidant's fear of intimacy makes it nearly impossible to appreciate emotional depth in real time. The avoidant needs the distance that separation provides in order to access their own emotional capacity. The avoidant is like person who cannot appreciate the beauty of landscape while standing directly in front of it, but can only appreciate it from miles away where it appears in miniature form. The empath's emotional intensity is exactly what the avoidant needs, but it is also exactly what the avoidant is terrified of. The empath offers everything the avoidant secretly wants, but the avoidant's fear makes them run from it. The avoidant decides they want independence and space, when what they are really running from is the terror of being loved so completely and unconditionally. The avoidant rejects the empath not because the empath is wrong, but because the avoidant is not ready for what the empath is offering. Over time with distance, the avoidant can process the fear more slowly. The avoidant can remember moments of warmth and connection without being simultaneously triggered by the intimacy that those moments required. The avoidant can recognize the value of emotional depth without being overwhelmed by the actual presence of that depth. Distance creates the safety the avoidant needs in order to actually feel and actually value what they have lost. But this creates an impossible situation. The avoidant can only value the empath from distance. The moment of actual reconnection activates the same fears that caused the original rejection. The avoidant falls in love with the memory of the empath and with the idea of the empath, but may not have more capacity for the actual empath than they did originally. The avoidant's love may be genuine, but it may also be permanently limited by the same defensive structures that caused the original hurt. What this means for empaths. Loving avoidance. For empaths who find themselves loving avoidance, the understanding that avoidants often fall in love only after rejection is both validating and heartbreaking. It validates that the empath's love and emotional offerings were not wrong. The avoidant's eventual recognition of the empath's value proves that the empath was offering something genuinely valuable. But it is heartbreaking because it suggests that the empath's love was too much too soon for the avoidant to receive, and that timing may have been the only problem, but timing may also be permanently wrong. Empaths in relationships with avoidants need to understand that they cannot force the avoidant to grow enough to receive their love while the relationship is ongoing. The avoidant may need the separation to develop the capacity to appreciate what the empath offered. But the empath cannot wait indefinitely, hoping that separation will eventually lead to the avoidant's transformation and return. Empaths also need to understand that if the avoidant does return and express love and regret, the empath does not owe the avoidant another chance. The empath has the right to prioritize their own well-being and their own healing over giving the avoidant opportunity to prove they have changed. The avoidant's love may be genuine, but it does not obligate the empath to risk being hurt again. The ultimate truth is that avoidants do often fall in love with the empaths they rejected, but this love often comes too late and in form that cannot be fully received or returned. The avoidant discovers the value of emotional depth and authentic connection only after ensuring that the person who could provide those things has moved on to protect themselves. This is one of the deepest tragedies in relationship dynamics, and it repeats endlessly whenever avoidants and empaths find each other. The specific moment when the avoidant recognizes what they lost. There is often a specific moment when the recognition hits the avoidant with full force. It may come when the avoidant sees the empath with someone else and realizes that another person is now receiving what the avoidant rejected. It may come when the avoidant is alone and thinking clearly about the relationship and suddenly understands that the empath was giving everything, while the avoidant was giving nothing. It may come during a moment of vulnerability when the avoidance defenses are temporarily lowered, and they can access their actual feelings. Sometimes the moment comes gradually rather than suddenly. The avoidant begins noticing small things that remind them of the empath. They notice someone else's emotional openness and recognize it as similar to what the empath offered. They hear song that takes them back to time with the empath. They have dream where the empath is still present in their life. These small moments accumulate until the avoidant cannot avoid the realization anymore. The moment of recognition is often accompanied by intense physical sensation. The avoidant may feel hollow in their chest. They may feel the weight of regret pressing down on them. They may feel panic about whether they could ever reach the empath again, or whether that chance has permanently passed. The physical sensation confirms to the avoidant that this loss is real and that the feelings for the empath are real. Once the recognition arrives, the avoidant often cannot ignore it. The knowledge that they loved the empath and pushed the empath away becomes constant companion to the avoidant's awareness. Even if the avoidant does not attempt to contact the empath or does not pursue reconciliation, the awareness stays with them. The avoidant carries knowledge of their mistake forward into all their future relationships. How the avoidance idealization creates distance between the memory and the reality. The avoidance idealization of the rejected empath actually creates distance between the memory the avoidant has created and the reality of who the empath actually is. The avoidant has transformed the empath into symbol of everything the avoidant lost through their own patterns. The empath becomes stand-in for the avoidant's own failure and the avoidant's own regret. In this idealized state, the avoidant cannot see the actual empath clearly anymore. The empath becomes pure goodness, pure emotional availability, pure everything the avoidant was missing. But actual people are more complex than idealization allows. The actual empath has flaws and struggles. The actual empath has their own defensive patterns. The actual empath has their own needs that extend beyond taking care of the avoidant. None of this complexity is present in the avoidant's idealized version. If the avoidant and the empath were to actually reconnect, the reality of the actual empath would shatter the idealized version the avoidant has been holding. The empath would likely be harder on the avoidant than the ideal version would be. The empath would likely have boundaries where the ideal version had boundless compassion. The empath would likely have moved on in ways that would disappoint the avoidant, who wanted the empath to have been waiting. This means that the avoidant is often in love with fantasy, rather than with reality. The avoidant is in love with who the empath was in the past and who the avoidant has made the empath into through memory and idealization. The avoidant is in love with a version of the empath that exists nowhere but in the avoidant's mind and heart. The avoidant is grieving the loss of relationship that existed but also grieving loss of fantasy version that never really was. Why the empath should not wait for the avoidance realization. One of the most important things for empaths to understand is that they should not wait around, hoping that eventually the avoidant will realize what they lost and will return transformed and ready to love fully. The realization the avoidant experiences is real, but it does not necessarily come with corresponding change in the avoidance capacity to be present in relationship. The empath has already given enough. The empath has already been the one reaching out and showing up and offering unconditional support. The empath should not spend their limited time on Earth waiting for someone to grow into capacity to appreciate them. The empath's time and emotional energy are valuable and deserve to be invested in people who can recognize that value in real time. The empath also often has ability to move into genuinely happy and fulfilling relationships with partners who appreciate them immediately. Rather than requiring years of separation and regret before the appreciation comes. The empath's emotional depth and capacity for compassion are gifts that are appreciated by secure people who do not require the empath to earn their recognition through suffering and waiting. The empath should also recognize that the avoidant's eventual falling in love with memory of the empath does not require the empath's participation. The avoidant can feel regret and love for the memory without the empath needing to respond or to engage with those feelings. The empath's healing does not depend on whether the avoidant eventually recognizes their value. The empath's worth is inherent and does not require the avoidant's belated acknowledgement, the possibility of growth and second chances. While the general pattern is that avoidants recognize the value of the empath only after the relationship ends, there are rare cases where the avoidant and empath do find way to reconnect and build genuine partnership. These cases usually involve the avoidant having done significant work on their patterns during the separation. The avoidant has often been in therapy. The avoidant has processed their own wounds. The avoidant has developed genuine capacity for presence that extends beyond the fantasy version. In these rare cases, the reconnection can be profound because both people bring their full selves to it. The empath brings healing wisdom from their own journey of separation and self-protection. The avoidant brings humility about their limitations and gratitude for the opportunity to be different. Both people have grown and changed and are no longer the same people they were in the original relationship. But these cases are rare. Most avoidants do not do the deep work necessary for genuine transformation. Most avoidants eventually move on and find new partners or remain alone. The recognition of what they lost becomes something they carry with them, but not something that actually changes their capacity to be in relationship. For the few avoidants who do genuinely transform, they often become the most devoted and appreciative partners because they understand what they almost lost. They understand how easily they could have thrown away the best thing that ever happened to them. They approach the relationship with awareness of how precious it is, but they arrived at this awareness through loss and pain. The path to genuine appreciation was necessarily through the painful recognition of what happened when the appreciation was missing. The lesson for those who love avoidance. The lesson of the avoidant falling in love with the rejected empath is that loving an avoidant requires accepting that the avoidant may never be fully capable of receiving the love in real time. The avoidant may eventually recognize the value of what you offer, but that recognition may come too late to help the relationship. You need to build your life on what you can control, which is your own choices, not on hope that eventually the avoidant will grow enough to match your capacity. You must love the avoidant you have, not the avoidant you hope they will become. You must set clear limits on how long you will wait and how much you will sacrifice. You must build life independent of whether the avoidant comes around. You must make peace with the possibility that you may be truly valued by the avoidant only after you have moved on. The most important lesson is that you deserve to be loved, fully and completely in the present moment, not years later in the form of regret and memory. You deserve partner who can appreciate you while you are still there, to receive that appreciation. You deserve to not have to wait decades for recognition of your worth. Your love and your emotional depth are precious, and they deserve to be valued by someone who is capable of valuing them. The profound irony of avoidant love for empaths. The profound irony of avoidant love for rejected empaths is that the love often becomes more powerful and more all-consuming precisely because it is impossible. The avoidant cannot have the empath, so the avoidant must have the fantasy. The fantasy can be perfect in ways the actual relationship never could be. The fantasy does not require the avoidant to change or to be vulnerable, or to sacrifice any of their need for independence. The fantasy allows the avoidant to experience the intensity of love without the actual cost of love. This means that the avoidant's love for the empath can be simultaneously genuine and not genuine. Genuine in that the avoidant truly feels overwhelming emotion when thinking about the empath. Genuine in that the avoidant truly recognizes the value of what they lost. But not genuine in that the avoidant is in love with memory and fantasy more than with the actual person. Not genuine in that if the empath actually became available, the avoidant's fear would likely return, and the avoidant would once again experience the empath as threatening rather than as treasure. This irony means that the empath cannot win. If the empath was available and present, the avoidant found it suffocating. If the empath becomes unavailable, the avoidant falls desperately in love with the memory of the empath. The empath can never be in the position where the avoidant genuinely values them in the present moment, where it actually counts. The avoidant's late recognition that the empath was worth everything creates situation where both people are left carrying grief. The empath grieves for the avoidant who pushed them away before they were ready to truly appreciate them. The avoidant grieves for the opportunity they allowed to slip away through their own fear and defensiveness. Both people are left with knowledge that something precious was lost, and that the loss was preventable if only one person could have been different, or if only the timing had been different. Understanding this tragic dynamic does not change it. The avoidant will continue to recognize value in empaths only after rejecting them. The empath will continue to offer love to avoidants who are not ready to receive it. The pattern will continue repeating until one or both people develop wisdom to stop participating in it. The avoidant can develop wisdom by doing genuine therapeutic work on their patterns. The empath can develop wisdom by recognizing that they cannot fix the avoidant and that their own well-being requires distance. The avoidant falls in love with the rejected empath, not because the empath was wrong, but because the avoidant was not ready. The avoidant falls in love with memory, not because memory is better than reality, but because the avoidant's fear makes the actual presence of the empath unmanageable. The avoidant's love is real, but it is love for someone who is no longer waiting. The empath has learned to protect themselves and has moved forward. The avoidant must live with knowledge of what they lost and what they could not receive when they had the chance. The timeless tragedy of avoidant and empath. This pattern of avoidance falling in love with rejected empaths is as old as human connection itself. It is a story of missed timing, of people coming together in moments when they are unprepared to receive what the other person is offering. It is a story of how fear can destroy what love could have built. It is a story of how awareness often comes too late, and how wisdom is often purchased at price of permanent loss. The pattern will continue as long as avoidance and empaths find each other, and as long as fear prevents genuine presence. The pattern will continue because the human heart is drawn to emotional depth, even when the mind is running from it. The pattern will continue because growth and change are difficult, and because some people never develop the capacity to receive the love that is offered to them in the moment it is offered. The avoidant will keep falling in love with the memory of the empath they rejected, and the empath will continue to open their heart to people who are not ready to receive it. This is the tragedy of human connection when attachment styles clash.